This is Redefining Trade, the podcast brought to you by TradeWindow to shine a light on the future of trade. Every month, our host Peter Foyson will be joined by those who are shifting the dial for trade across New Zealand, Australia, and Asia. We will be exploring the latest thinking on trade innovation, supply chain management, export trends, digital trade, blockchain, trade law, trade in the face of COVID-19, and we'll be opening a whole new window on the world of exporting.
You're now listening to part 2.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was quite interesting, but now I'm quite keen to get into the little bit more geeky parts because, hey, that's what I am. I'm a geek at heart. And so let's talk a little bit about the more technical side of things. So what would you think is the most something that you find confuses people the most in blockchain technology? How do you go about demystifying this?
It's an interesting question, and I can really only speak from the experience of standing on hundreds of stages and talking to a whole bunch of different industries and a whole bunch of different regulators and policymakers about the sort of main first questions that get brought up. The first and most obvious one is still people think blockchains are cryptocurrencies and there is no sort of distinction between the two. I think it's really important to tell people that in many of these early networks, the point of the cryptocurrency was to maintain the consensus of the ledger. It existed to provide a type of value. That's why Bitcoin existed. It also is a store of value.
Fruit. Yes,
exactly right. So that's sort of a basic one. We still constantly get asked about blockchain destroying the planet in terms of environmental costs. And this comes from the consensus mechanism in Bitcoin, right? The point of the consensus mechanism in Bitcoin is for it to be very economically expensive for you to put in for a miner to put in a bad transaction, right? To defect. The way that is expensive is through high energy cost and through high computation cost, right? That's the point. That's how it's secured. And I don't think there's any way around that. There's a lot of talk around renewable energy or green Bitcoins, maybe Bitcoins that are mined in a green way. That's possible, but it's really important to note for people that the innovations that have happened in consensus mechanisms since those early days in Bitcoin are enormous. Most new blockchains today, public chains, are proof of stake chains, which are fundamentally different in terms of those energy costs. So for the listeners out there, in a proof of work Bitcoin style system, computationally expensive processes maintain the network effectively. In a proof of stake system, validators, which are kind of like miners, are staking or bonding effectively some capital so that if they put in an invalid transaction or do some other undesirable behavior, that bond or stake is slashed, right? So it's fundamentally secured in a different way. You're securing it by that capital rather than by the ongoing computationally expensive stuff. What other things are people confused about? Almost every conference that I go to, someone asks about crime. Isn't this what drug dealers do? The data says no. The data that we have is that it's not a huge issue in these networks. But also, if I was going to commit a crime or advise someone committing a crime, do not use cryptocurrency. Use cash. It just doesn't make sense. And there's an enormous amount of work going into chain analysis of issues that happen on chain. A lot of authorities are getting involved in this because the nature of blockchains is that the transactions are traceable. At some point there was an onboarding. At some point there was an offboarding. You can put the pieces together. So I think they're sort of the main ones. The reasons of, actually, I'll add one more to that there's a misconception that there's going to be one blockchain, right? I see this as a technology that I think we're going into a multi-chain sort of world. I think that's inevitable. And those chains will have different properties. Some will be more permission. Some will be permissionless. Some will be optimized for privacy. Some will be optimized for security. They're serving different trust problems in an economy and they will look different. And we're in a process of figuring that out, and there will still be an enormous amount of evolution from here around all of those questions.
And they will be orchestrated, yes.
Yes, exactly. What's your main thing you think needs to be demystified, Guy?
I think the biggest thing is everybody thinks like, so who's in charge? So what about the governance? There, in this unpermissioned blockchain world, who's in charge? How can that even work if nobody is in charge? And how can you not have something where you can't blame somebody? So that's what I'm stumbling upon most is probably the one that kind of people keep edging me on about. It can't just work with incentive system, game theory, and cryptography and distributed algorithms only. And yeah, it does.
Well, it turns out it does. And I think it's a real... Blockchains are confusing because they're a big step change in how we coordinate with each other. And I think we've all grown up in an environment where someone makes a decision, someone's liable, there's ultimately a hierarchy somewhere. And the fact is, in a lot of these circumstances, they're not there, and it's not there on purpose. And I think we're going to see a whole bunch of regulatory problems around how to solve that problem. Can you have a managed investment scheme when there's no manager? I don't know. Is a DAO a company if it doesn't have a director? Well, no, because that's how we define a company.
If there's no contract and terms and conditions in place.
Exactly. But I think a lot of people don't understand that the innovation in these technologies is that we're making decentralized systems work, and we're making it work through a combination of technologies, cryptography and a bunch of other technologies, together with economic incentives to make it all come together. Sometimes that falls apart, right? But we're only 12 years in, and that's sort of what we're trying to figure out.
Indeed, yeah. All right, let's move to something different. So what do you find the most exciting thing about this technology and why? I mean, a lot of that we could glance already, but is there something that particularly sticks out for you?
There's a few things. I think innovations in institutional technologies like blockchain are very rare. They happen on the order of centuries rather than decades. And I think that's one of the things that is really exciting that's happened since 2008. And that means we're getting really rapid innovation on a sort of different level of the economy. It's on the level of rule systems. It's on the level of what do these organizations look like. And that's really exciting. From an economist's perspective, it's great that most of this is open source. It's just incredible to see the innovation that's happening because these things are forced out into the open, because they're decentralized networks. And I mean, I understand a lot of the listeners are not, of course, deep in the blockchain space, but you see these waves of enormous advances in the blockchain space. So in 2020, we saw what's known as DeFi summer, which is where we invented all of these decentralized finance primitives, ways you could loan online, ways you could create exchanges online. Last year, we all heard about NFTs, right? Non-fungible tokens. These are, so Bitcoin, most cryptocurrencies are fungible in the sense that I don't care whether I have Bitcoin number 1 or Bitcoin number 15 million. I'm happy to have either of them.
From a pump. It doesn't matter which of the liters you're driving to work with.
Exactly right. So that's fungibility. We can swap them. It doesn't matter. A non-fungible token, well, it's the opposite. It matters which one you have. So when we talk about NFTs, they are often in the digital art world. They represent ownership over a particular thing. Now, we can have as many arguments as we like around the hype and the bubble around NFTs and so on. But what just happened is an incredible innovation in property rights. We have a new kind of bundle of property rights that exists on the internet. It's digitally native. Some people are paying millions of dollars for these property rights. They may be paying too much. They may be paying too little. We don't know. But we've seen this enormous innovation, and it's open source, and people are building on top of it. And then this year, we're talking about DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, which are, we could go down that sort of rabbit hole as well. These are essentially organizations on the internet coordinated through blockchain technology. So, a typical sort of definition there is around, this is like an online community with a shared bank account. and we can vote to do what we wish with that capital.
Yeah.
But that's a little bit of a tangent. In the trade
Let me pick
space,
up on that quickly,
yes.
just to looping it back to the trade space. So with NFTs, a lot of silly things are happening, like zombie monkeys, crypto kittens, and whatever, those collectibles and more kind of silly things. DAOs, as you've just mentioned, but bringing these together. So I think this is kind of the playground for exploring what is possible with NFTs. How do they work? And where now some of the DAOs are bringing things together. I know somebody working for MakerDAO, and they really want to go and tokenize. So tokenization is representing a real world asset as an NFT. So they want to go and tokenize bills of lading, which are very important for international trade, and then use those to award trade finance systems, build trade finance systems on top of that. So there's some really interesting things happening exactly on this front for the trade sector in trade tech.
So very much so.
To throw that in, because it was just so nice in context of what you had just kind of brought forward in the evolution of what people are discovering on blockchain tech.
That's exactly right. And if we look at the innovation that happens in the blockchain space, what has happened over the last 3 years has been in decentralized finance. How do we build purely digital, crypto native financial systems? We're going to ignore the banks completely. We're going to ignore governments completely. We're going to go off and make them work using these economic incentives. The same with NFTs, right? We're trying to do that in the purely digital world. And I think over the next few years, we are going to see that move back into the physical world or connect it with the traditional economy. So I am super optimistic about, for instance, tokenizing agricultural inventory, grain or sheep or whatever products are on the farm into a blockchain, and then using that as collateral to get a loan against that underlying physical inventory, right? I think that is what trade finance will look like in the future, of these physical products connecting in with this decentralized infrastructure. And DAOs are all tied up in there. I mean, I'll be amazed if in 10 years, most co-ops aren't DAOs. And that, of course, is across a lot of the agriculture space and a lot of the trade space. But the point is, we're creating these things that look weird and experimental, and why would we ever use that in the real world? Well, they're being tested in the hardest possible online environment, and then they're going to come back into the real world. And I think that's what we're going to see over the next few years.
Indeed. I had, in preparation of this, taken note of a question I wanted to ask you, but we've kind of touched base on some of the things already, so I'll modify that a little bit. It's about the whole discrepancy between the public or unpermissioned blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then the private or permissioned or consortium blockchains that are operated by companies or consortiums. So where are you sitting kind of deep in your heart? Are you more kind of a man of the unpermissioned free world, Wild West, public blockchains, or are you sitting more? Yeah, I know it's it's not just a necessary kind of thing to make it more palatable to some adopters, but do you think that there's more value in the consortium blockchains that are tuned for high efficiency, for serving a particular purpose, and that are under the governance of a particular selected group?
To put all my cards on the table, most of the work that I do is in public permissionless systems, and that's for a particular reason. They're harder problems to solve quite often. You need to design those economic incentives. You need to figure out how they work and so on. But I definitely see these permissioned systems as a stepping stone towards that. And in particular contexts like trade, I think there is a big argument for permission systems making a lot more sense, at least in the short term. So just to give a broad overview of what we're talking about for the listeners, there's a lot of, all blockchains aren't the same. They have different properties. They have different properties in terms of how you sort of spin them up. So you can have a public or permissionless system. Think of that as one extreme, where anyone can come in and take part in the consensus process. Anyone can be a miner in Bitcoin. You'll need a bit of capital to do it, but anyone can do it. Anyone can write transactions to the Bitcoin blockchain, and anyone can read any of the transactions in the Bitcoin blockchain. It's open, right? Read, write, add, that's one end. The other end is a much more permission system where you know who is validating the transactions. Perhaps it's a consortia of shipping companies or a consortia of industry bodies or whatever it happens to be. So it's less decentralized, but it means that you can have much more specific rights around who can read data, who can write data, and that fits in much more tightly with the desires of the trade industry generally, if we want to call it a trade industry at the moment. So I've worked with a lot of on a lot of these sort of projects, and one of the first questions that comes up with trade clients is, "But what about my data? That's commercially sensitive data. I don't want to share it with anyone," and so on and so forth. And they're worried about those sort of operational data privacy concerns. And you can achieve those objectives much more readily in a permission system. I think what will happen over time, and we're not there yet, is I think that the tooling in public systems will get much better. I think we'll innovate a lot more in public systems in terms of identity management, in terms of data rights and how you share data and so on. And that might bring some of those permission systems towards the permissionless end. But we're never going to get this technology adopted in supply chains if we don't largely start on that permissioned end. I just don't think it's palatable to the industry. One thing that I think we're missing, and we haven't seen very much of, this might be a little bit too much in the weeds, is one of the major benefits of a public permissionless system is that you can reward early participants with tokens, right? You can reward people, for instance, for adding data into a data pool. Now, we haven't seen this yet that much in trade, but that might be the future of what trade networks look like on the permissioned end. And that could be one of the major benefits, that you can add, whenever you're adding data into this pool, and you're being paid effectively to make some of that data public. And that might be where we head, but that's a little bit of a rabbit hole to go down, Guy.
Yeah, I think this is also an awesome segue into something I wanted to know from you. So where do you see the trade sector on the adoption curve with blockchain there?
I find this question really hard to answer, and it's because we're dealing with permission networks the majority of the time. And what that means is that the innovation we're seeing in blockchain trade and blockchain supply chains is often happening behind closed doors, and it's hard to see exactly how the consortia are formed, how they're governed, how they're working. A lot of it happens sort of in the background. So it's hard to sort of pinpoint It's like with online banking. You don't want to know the cryptography. You just want it to be secure. And it's the same thing there with the trade sector, probably. They don't want to be needing to know that blockchain is in their way. They just want to know that this thing is bulletproof and robust. That's exactly right. I mean, blockchain is just one part of this broader tech stack, right? And the clients don't necessarily need to know that there's a blockchain underpinning it. They just need to know that that data hasn't changed since it went in there. We've got the magical mathematics behind there that tell you it hasn't changed, but that's all you need to know as a customer. I also think we're going to see much more sort of modularity. So I think if you're designing any kind of blockchain system in the trade space, you have to be ready that this is going to evolve over time. So you want to be starting to think about what the sort of, how this all stacks together if you wanted to switch between different chains, or if some party was no longer there, or if that party, that blockchain, I don't know, falls over or whatever. So there's a lot of, that's a very roundabout way to talk about your question. It's very hard to see where we're at on the adoption curve. I think there's a lot happening behind the scenes that we're not hearing about.
So in the long term, how will the full-scale adoption of technology change the world of trade? So this is extrapolating beyond just blockchain, but obviously blockchain being one of the stepping stones. So this is an even harder question to answer than the first one, the previous one, I suppose.
They're big questions, and I don't think enough people are thinking about that particular question. The question effectively is, what happens to our trading networks when we have high trust trade? We have much more granulated, deep information about all of the products that are moving around a global economy. And that's not as simple as saying, well, things will move faster and things will be cheaper and that's better for consumers because they know their coffee's organic or whatever. I think it goes much better than that, much deeper than that. So we can think about a few potential impacts, and this is me putting my economist hat on. Decommoditization. Now, that's a long word. In an economy, we commoditize some products and treat them as the same and sell them for the same price because it's too high cost to differentiate those products, or we don't have the capacity to differentiate them, so we treat them all as the same. I'll give you an example. Coffee. We used to just treat coffee as coffee, right? We put it all together. It doesn't matter where it's from. It's just coffee. Coffee famously got decommoditized. Now I know that my coffee is from this slope in this country and was produced in this exact way. And when you decommoditize a product, you end up with more niche markets and more premium prices for all of those different products. Now, what blockchain enables us to do is decommoditize some products. I don't know what those products are, but what you will predict is if we get much lower cost ability to differentiate between this avocado and this avocado, then, well, do consumers care about that? Are they willing to pay twice the price for this one than this one? And I think that'll be a process that we'll figure out over the next few years, probably longer than that.
So you mean this could be opening up kind of niche markets that
Exactly.
either by the big players to kind of go more into the lower volume but higher quality segments, or by just extrapolating here a little bit. So you've mentioned initially on in this answer lowering the cost and increasing the speed. But I could imagine this is also going to lower the barriers, make it easier. And through making it easier, maybe also smaller niche players can play along. If you're looking at what the internet has done, you can have niche musicians having success out there because they can publish their stuff independently. So maybe in this case, your little mom and pop shop around the corner in the sticks of the backcountry, they might be exporting their little whatever sweet goo honey by well-known bees that they all high-five each morning themselves, or something like that.
I think that is exactly right. And I don't know what markets that will happen in. That's the entrepreneurial question. What things do consumers actually care about? Because what if we decommoditize this thing and consumers go, well, I want to pay the same price. I don't care about that characteristic that you're trying to differentiate it on. So I think there'll be a process here of like lots of niche markets emerging and then collapsing again and trying to figure that out. So that's sort of one example. What else? Who captures value in a supply chain is partly due to the information that they have in relation to other parties, or what economists call information asymmetries. If we have deeper, more transparent information along a supply chain, you would expect who captures value along that supply chain to change. So I make wine in Australia, for instance, and imagine you're in Hong Kong, right? And you want to buy a bottle of premium New Zealand or Australian wine. Where do you buy it from? Well, you probably go to a restaurant, a high-end restaurant, or you probably go to a high-end trusted bottle shop brand, right? Because you're skeptical. This is an expensive bottle of wine. You know there's a huge amount of fraud. Now, those parties at the end of the supply chain, the bottle shop and the high-end restaurant, they capture the value from taking on the risk and ensuring that their supply chains are correct, right? They charge a premium for that, for just ensuring that it's the correct supply chain. What if I can verify that you can verify that directly as a consumer? You can scan a chip in the top of the wine bottle or whatever it happens to be, and you can be pretty confident that this is a real Australian premium wine that you're after. Well, maybe the value that's captured along the supply chain doesn't go so much to the restaurant, but goes to the winemaker. Right. So I think we're going to see this process where, as more light is shed on supply chains, that some of these sort of bottlenecks along the way of people benefiting from information asymmetries actually push value back to primary producers.
Yeah. So you're referring to basically the story around provenance of the products.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, that's right. So that's another one. I can keep going if you like. I think about this.
Provenance and blockchain are kind of a marriage made in heaven because it's immutable. So therefore, everything can be audited later on with the knowledge that things have not been tampered with in the meantime. So yes, absolutely.
That's exactly right. And what's important to think about there as well is, this is a major problem for blockchain and trade is how do other technologies such as IoT devices fit into this? So the classic problem with the blockchain is that the blockchain will not tell you whether the information inputted into it is correct, right, or verified or whatever. It will tell you what information went in, and you can tell that that information hasn't changed over time. But it doesn't mean that that is the wine bottle in your hand that it claims is its digital twin or NFT on a blockchain. And so what we're seeing is a lot more connections with IoT devices in this space. So
yes.
let's
and digital identities and identities of devices, of companies, of individuals, everything. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
You've mentioned you could go on there for a long time. I don't think we have the time in this podcast, even though I love the chat and it's really good. So Darcy, thank you so much for joining us to chat today. We've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure the listeners have learned a lot. And even though some things in part 2 were maybe a little bit over their heads, but maybe we're going to source a few more technically inclined listeners to this podcast this way as well, which I would much appreciate. So thanks for listening to the Redefining Trade podcast. Thanks, and have an awesome day.
Thanks for having me.
This has been Redefining Trade by TradeWindow with our host, Peter Foyston. Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit subscribe and keep an eye out for the next episode.